That night, the kitchen light burned like a spotlight I hadn't bought tickets to. They told me I was ridiculous, a dreamer who would fail, an embarrassment to the family. Beekeeping on rooftops? My cousin sneered. You can't even keep a plant alive in a dorm, let alone run a city. Mom pressed her lips together. Dad shrugged as if swatting at a fly. The room tilted, and I heard the acrid hum of bees in my ears. Not a sound, but a verdict. This would end badly. And you'll ruin us in the process. In that moment, I tasted metal on my tongue. Humiliation, fear, and a stubborn heat that wouldn't go out. The pattern was clear. I wasn't the girl who fit the family ledger. I was the error they'd annotate and ignore. And I knew then that if I stayed, I'd vanish twice. Once from their expectations, and again from the future I believed could be saved by pollinators and rooftops. Painful departure. I left not only a house, but a ceiling of expectations crushing my chest. In the corporate chemistry lab where I'd hoped to blend science with social goods, I'd been hailed as a fringe eccentric the moment I proposed urban beekeeping to combat pollinator decline. The words ridiculous and embarrassment weren't whispered behind doors. They were shouted across the break room, jotted in margins of grant proposals, sung in the chorus of quarterly reviews. They told me the numbers wouldn't add up, that a city's appetite for honeyed science would never support a movement born on a rooftop's edge. I listened to the elevator pitch of doubt. Then I turned away from the polished glass and walked out with nothing but a coat full of pollen-scented resolve and a ledger of plans I could not shred. So I started moving. The departure was not a single moment, but a process. Late-night drives through a city that had forgotten how to breathe. Meetings with neighbors who mistook me for a charity case until I showed them the data. Rooftop after rooftop, a hive here, a hydroponic panel there, a pocket garden tucked between vents and skylights. I learned to speak the language of soil and thermodynamics to people who didn't care about origin stories, as long as the lettuce tasted fresh. The ridicule didn't disappear. It turned into a quiet soundtrack I learned to tune out. What mattered was the work, the bees, the boxes, the careful choreography of water, nectar, and sunlight that coaxed a failing city back toward life. The professional dismissal found its opposite in the field's stubborn truth. Ecosystems respond to care, not cynicism. Arduous ascension. The climb was brutal and beautiful, like lifting a broken staircase from a cratered hill. I started with a handful of pilot rooftops, office towers where wind stitched between glass and copper, hospitals where healing needed to be more than medicine, schools that deserved a curriculum stitched with the sweetness of blooming. Grants showed up, not as windfalls, but as tiny gusts that I learned to weather. Volunteers appeared, students, retirees, neighbors, people who believed that a single hive could become a chorus of renewal. The city didn't instantly bow. It grew into the idea, every season rewriting what was possible. Pollinators returned in numbers that surprised my skeptical colleagues who'd once scoffed at a fringe plan. The urban beekeeping movement morphed into sustainable city agriculture, then into environmental restoration. Pollinator corridors stitched along abandoned lots, rooftop forests pressed into service as microforests of edible and medicinal plants, edible gardens feeding a neighborhood that had forgotten what it felt like to taste sunlight on a tomato. The ascent wasn't only ecological, it was relational. I learned to negotiate with property owners who feared lawsuits, with city bureaucrats who feared nothing would come of a pilot project they signed off on decades ago, with school teachers who finally saw a science project that didn't end with a test score, but with a living hive. The numbers danced in a language I'd once been told I couldn't speak. Honey yields rising, native bee species returning, pollination rates climbing in neighborhoods that had once watched their street trees fall to policy neglect. I learned to argue with the city's own sense of practicality and found that practicality, when backed with data and community buy-in, can become poetry. The field of triumph sustainable urban agriculture and environmental restoration grew into a movement that pierced the concrete shell of a sprawling metropolis and coaxed it toward resilience. The ridicule I carried like a badge melted into something not merely acceptable, but inevitable. That a fringe eccentric could realign a city's destiny with the ledger of the land itself. Cathartic return and poetic justice. I came home not with a trophy, but with a proof, the city's fingerprints on my sleeves and my sleeves pressed against the city's heart. The invitation was simple. Come back for a real reckoning and bring the future you promised. So I did. I walked into that house, not as the daughter who had vanished, but as the woman who had planted a forest in the horizon. The scene unfolded on a late summer afternoon, when the yard's dead soil finally held a whisper of green. The family gathered in a circle I hadn't seen since the day of the accusation. Faces lined with the weather of years, yet the air carried a different weather now. One that hummed with bees rather than gossip. I led them to the back wall where a cascade of rooftop yards rose in miniature terraces of edibles and pollinator plants. A living blueprint of the city's new spine. A portable stage stood at the edge, microphones warming, a city official's voice reading a short proclamation about urban agriculture as essential infrastructure. Then I opened the hive. The first hum rose like a chorus awakening after a long winter. The bees moved with a patient rigor that felt almost sacred, as if they were delivering a verdict more enduring than any courtrooms. Honey dripped into jars labeled with the neighborhoods we'd touched, each jar a map, each map a memory of a life I'd refused to abandon. My sister blinked, unprepared for the sight of a life that hadn't been a joke, but a promise kept. My mother's eyes filled with something I hadn't seen since childhood. Pride, amazement, and that stubborn ache of having misread a whole human being. My father, whose sarcasm had once cut like winter, swallowed a breath and nodded as if to acknowledge an account finally balanced. "Why didn't you tell us it could be this big?" my mother asked, her voice low, almost shy. I smiled, not with triumph but with clarity. "Because I needed you to see me by what I did, not by what you thought I couldn't be. The ledger isn't just about how I started, it's about what I paid forward." And then I spoke what I'd learned in the years between laughter and harvest. That every dream worth growing is a contribution to the world's memory. Our shared memory of what is possible when we choose to steward the soil beneath the city's feet. The house became a campus for forgiveness. Apologies offered without the bitterness of pride. Forgiveness granted with the quiet ferocity of a dawn. In the days that followed, my family began to show up not to belittle but to learn. They started tending the balcony boxes, inviting neighbors to taste the honey, to hear the story of a girl who turned a ridiculous dream into a city's backbone. I didn't need their permission anymore to exist in the world I'd chosen. I needed their presence, their hands, their belief when belief felt like a lifeline. I've learned to carry more than nectar in a jar. I carry a principle that destiny isn't a neat circle, but a ledger that balances through effort, courage, and mercy. The city's ecosystems still teach me. The bees still question me with their constant patient gaze, and I still answer, every day, with work. Rooftop gardens, edible landscapes, pollinator corridors, communities fed and protected. If I'm a fringe eccentric, I'm the kind of eccentric that makes a whole city think differently about what home means. And if karma has a ledger, it's written in the honeyed notes of a beehive and the stubborn, hopeful lines of a family finally on the right side of belief. We end not with the triumph that shouts, but with the triumph that heals. My dream didn't just survive. It reshaped what counts as success and who gets to decide what a life is worth. The future feels less like a risk and more like a garden we've learned to plant together. The more I heal the soil, the more I understand that destiny isn't a punishment for daring. It's a reward for having the courage to dare again, despite the chorus that said you would fail. And so I continue, grounded in the ledger of my choices, bright with bees and possibility, certain that a single rooftop, a single hive, a single voice can redraw a city's future, and maybe, just maybe, redeem the past that tried to define it for us.